Hello and welcome to Written Words. This month has been all about writing essays. In my previous video, we talked about the basics of essay writing, what you need to do to prepare before you write the essay, how to plan the essay itself, and what you need to include in an essay. And for this video, we're going to look at an actual essay. We're going to work through an essay together and go through the process from planning to actually writing the essay. Just a little caveat to start with, of course, the essay that you write will depend on why you're writing it. Who has asked you to write the essay? Why do they want you to write it? If it's for some kind of study, then you will need to know what is in the syllabus, what is it that is required of you. You'll need to know what you're expected to include in the essay, what you're expected to show that you know and understand. Also, you'll need to check what the particular requirements are of your course. How long does the essay have to be, for example? For the purposes of this video, there is no examiner, there is no required word length. It's just an essay that I've written as an example. So the first thing you need to do when you want to write an essay is to start by doing your research. Read up on the subject that you need to talk about. If it's literature, know the work of literature very well that you want to talk about. In my case, the essay that we're going to look at today is Should Poems Rhyme? So my preparation naturally involved reading lots of poems and making notes on them and thinking about the rhyme or the absence of rhyme and whether it was an advantage or a disadvantage and why. So I made lots of notes, and when I'd finished reading and making notes, I was ready to plan the essay. My plan is based on the 3-part essay with a beginning, a middle and an end, although those 3 parts are not equal in length. Obviously, the middle part, the main body of the essay, is going to be the longest. The introduction and the conclusion are going to be much shorter than the main body, where we actually work through the material and explore it in detail. So this is what my plan looks like. In my introduction, I'm going to state the purpose of my essay. I'm going to explain the methods that I plan to use for that. And in my case, I'm going to analyse 4 poems, 2 rhyming and 2 non-rhyming. I'm also going to define the terms poem and rhyme for the purposes of the essay, because definitions of those terms may well vary depending on who you ask. So I'm going to establish the particular definitions that I'm going to use as the basis of my essay. The main body of the essay I'm going to divide into 3 sections. My first section is going to be about rhyming poetry. I'm going to look at 2 poems that rhyme, and for each poem I'm going to explore the advantages and disadvantages of rhyme in those poems. And then for section 2, I'm going to do the same, but for non-rhyming poetry. For each poem, I'm going to look at the advantages and disadvantages of the non-rhyming format. And then for part 3, I'm going to briefly mention other types of poetry. Obviously, I've only chosen 4 poems out of a countless multitude of poems that actually exist. So I'm going to briefly mention other kinds of poetry that I haven't covered in this essay, such as poetry from different cultures, children's verse and humour. Then for my conclusion, I'm going to summarise my findings, and then I'm going to state my verdict. Having looked at all the evidence, what conclusion have I come to? So let's have a look at the essay itself. Let's begin with the introduction. For the introduction, I said I'm going to state the purpose, I'm going to list my methods, and I'm going to include some definitions. So here is my introduction. The question of whether poems should rhyme is a complex and potentially emotive one. In this essay, I will visit both sides of the debate and attempt to determine which argument is the strongest. In order to do this, I will examine 4 poems, 2 of them rhyming and 2 non-rhyming, from different eras, and identify some of the advantages and disadvantages of these 2 different approaches. The 4 poems are Sonnet 18 by William Shakespeare, People Will Always Need People by Benjamin Zephaniah, Psalm 23 from the King James Version of the Bible, and Tulips by Sylvia Plath. Before analysing these poems, however, I will begin with some definitions. As people's definitions of poetry vary as widely as their opinions on whether it should rhyme, I will use the Oxford Dictionary definition for the purposes of this essay. A poem, a piece of imaginative writing arranged in a particular rhythm and also often in rhyme. According to this definition, a poem must have rhythm, whereas rhyme is frequently present but not obligatory. As rhyming is also an important element of this essay, here is the Oxford Dictionary's definition of rhyme. Rhyme, of a word, syllable or line. Have or end with the same sound as another. Because a rhyme is the repetition of the same sounds at the end of words, usually at the end of a line in a poem or song, it's used to create a musical or aesthetic effect. Since rhymes only concern the sounds of words, the spelling does not need to be similar. A perfect or exact rhyme occurs when the final stressed syllable and any syllables after it are identical. For example, boat, note, above, my love, guitar, you are. And those rhymes are taken from the poem The Owl and the Pussycat by Edward Lear. The following are examples of near or half rhymes in which the final sounds are similar but not identical. Boat, most, above, unloved, guitar, sincere. Non-rhyming poetry is often referred to as free verse. However, as free verse involves the absence not only of rhyme but also of other common structural aspects of poetry, I will avoid using this term for the purposes of this essay, since my focus here is specifically on rhyme. So that's the introduction. Now turning to the main body of the essay, which I've divided into 3 parts, here is part 1 in which I look at rhyming poetry. And remember that when you make a statement in an essay, you need to back it up with evidence. So hopefully that's what I've done here, making statements and backing them up with evidence from the 4 poems. I have chosen 2 very diverse poems as examples of rhyming poetry. Sonnet 18, perhaps the best known of Shakespeare's sonnets, was first published in 1609, whereas Benjamin Zephaniah's poem, People Will Always Need People, which became particularly popular during the coronavirus lockdown due to its subject matter, is an example of modern rhyming poetry. Shakespeare's poem being a sonnet, it follows a specific rhyming pattern and metre. As with most of his sonnets, the rhyme scheme is A-B-A-B, C-D-C-D, E-F-E-F, G-G. And rhythmically it follows the iambic pentameter structure, an unstressed syllable followed by a stressed syllable, repeated 5 times in each line, i.e. 10 syllables per line. The lines themselves are arranged into 3 quatrains and a couplet. That's 3 units of 4 lines each, ending with a 2-line rhyming unit. As a result, the form is a very rigid one, and sonnet writers find themselves writing within a highly restrained set of parameters. For some, like Shakespeare, this encourages their creativity and results in beautiful poetry. But for others, it could lead to forced rhymes and poor word choices in order to fit the rhyme scheme and/or the metre, thus stifling the creative process. Shakespeare, however, excels at this form of writing, and the natural feel of his rhymes and rhythms have led to his poetry being much loved and often quoted. For example, the final lines of the poem: "So long as men can breathe or eyes can see, so long lives this, and this gives life to thee." In this example, see and thee fit perfectly into the sentence and do not feel as if they've been added for the sake of the rhyme. Additionally, the rhythm of the words follows natural speech patterns, making it easy to read aloud. There is also a certain symmetry to the lines, which comes from the arrangement of each one into two clauses, as well as the repetition of "so long" at the beginning of each line. The other rhyming poem I've chosen is also musical in character. Benjamin Zephaniah was a musician as well as a poet, and distinct musical rhythms can be felt in his poetry. In an interview in 1987, he said, "I think poetry should be alive. You should be able to dance to it." "People Will Always Need People" has a clear rhythm, and it would certainly be possible to dance to a recital of it. The poem does follow a clear rhyming pattern, with the line "people will always need people" being repeated at regular intervals, and the variation "it's useful to have other people" also occurring regularly in between, rather like the refrain of a song. "People will always need people" is repeated twice at the end of the final verse, as is often found in songs too. The rhymes are perhaps not as subtle as Shakespeare's, but their boldness serves to place emphasis on the ends of the lines, such as "pax," "relax," "facts," or "please," "tease," "ease." From these two examples of rhyming poetry, it's clear that although rhyme is an important component of both poems, it's not the only source of their beauty and impact. The rhythm, symmetry, and word choices also add to their musicality and lend emphasis to the meaning of words. So that's the first section on rhyming poetry, and now I turn to my second section, non-rhyming poetry. Turning next to non-rhyming poetry, my first choice is perhaps an unusual one. The text of Psalm 23 from the King James Bible, published in 1611, is actually a translation of a much older Hebrew text. However, the English King James Bible is itself important, not only as a religious text, but also due to its historical, literary, and linguistic significance. The King James Version English translation of Psalm 23 does not rhyme, but as the Psalms were probably written to be sung, it does possess a musical quality, and it has indeed been set to music many times. In the traditional version set to the Crimond melody, the lyrics have been slightly altered to make them rhyme, but the more modern setting by Howard Goodall, for example, follows the natural flow of the King James Version more closely. Much of the text's musicality comes from its structure and patterns. The psalm consists of 6 sentences, and each sentence is a numbered biblical verse. The sentences themselves are divided into sections by colons and semicolons, like lines of poetry, and the punctuation breaks up the lines so that the rhythm and other patterns become clearer. In the first 2 sentences, the 2 halves are of similar length, but this then changes from the 3rd sentence, which has a much longer second part, and a 3-part structure emerges in verses 4 and 5. Then the final sentence is divided into 2 longer sections, again of similar length, giving the structure a kind of arc. There is also some apparently deliberate repetition, with all 4 parts in verses 2 and 3 beginning with he, creating an emphasis on the pronoun, and then switching to me at the end of both sections in verse 4. Then in verse 5, thou begins the 2 sections, and verse 6 finishes with a focus on the first person with me and I. There is also some mirroring of syllabic rhythms, for example, green pastures and still waters, or thou preparest and thou anointest, or through the valley and of the shadow, the latter being particularly prominent in Howard Goodall's musical setting. The presence of structure, rhythm and patterns, in my opinion, give the psalm a musical quality despite the absence of rhyme. My second choice of non-rhyming poem, Sylvia Plath's Tulips, was first published in 1965, several centuries after the King James Bible. Set in a hospital, it explores the theme of sickness and confinement, so an upbeat dancing rhythm might not be appropriate in this case. Instead, the rhythmic pattern is more fluid, with enjambment urging on the pace between many lines. There is a selection of inline rhythms too. Many of the lines have a 2-part feel. For example, the tulips are too excitable. It is winter here. Later, a rhythmic 3-part line emphasises how calm and ordered things were before the tulips came. Coming and going, breath by breath, without any fuss. However, with the arrival of the tulips, the regularity of the rhythm is broken. Now the air snags and eddies round them the way a river snags and eddies round a sunken rust-red engine. The tone of the first half of the poem is calm, as the poet has resigned herself to her illness and lies back, letting the nurses do whatever they need to take care of her. In the second half, though, the mood changes as she's irritated by the vase of tulips in the room. In addition to the above techniques, the use of colour is emphasised too, as the calm first half is associated with white, while the second half is disrupted by the redness of the tulips. Although there are no exact rhymes, there are a few half rhymes, such as explosions and surgeons, the sheet cuff and that will not shut, or trinkets and tablets. But they are few and far between. However, in the absence of rhymes, there are still plenty of other aspects which give this poem a wholly poetic quality. And then in my third section, I briefly acknowledged the existence of many other kinds of poetry. So far in this essay, I have examined just 4 poems, all of them in the English language and aimed at adults. However, there is, of course, a countless multitude of poems in a wide range of styles and tones, written in all the languages of the world and from every cultural background. So the answers to the question of whether poetry should rhyme will vary hugely from one poetry reader to another. Children's poetry, for example, is predominantly rhyming. The rhymes and rhythms of children's verse aid speech development and memorization, as well as giving it a light-hearted tone. Rhyme also lends itself well to humorous poetry because of its ability to lighten the tone. This aspect of rhyme, however, is less useful for poets wanting to write about more serious subjects without trivializing them. So non-rhyming poetry can be preferable in such cases. In some cultures, rhyme and poetry are considered synonymous, and non-rhyming verse is eschewed by poets and readers. This is my experience of Russian culture, where reciting poetry is a popular pastime at social gatherings, and Alexander Pushkin, the national poet who wrote an entire novel in rhyming iambic tetrameter, Eugene Onegin, is held in high esteem. As it would be impossible to analyse the poetry and literary traditions of all places and all times in just a few pages, I will base my conclusions for this essay on the 4 poems already discussed. And finally, the conclusion, a brief summary, and my verdict based on the evidence. To return to the Oxford Dictionary definition of a poem as a piece of imaginative writing arranged in a particular rhythm and also often in rhyme, this suggests that imagination and rhythm are essential to a poem, whereas rhyme is optional. Based on the 4 poems studied in this essay, this is certainly true. All 4 poems are imaginatively written, and all 4 have elements of rhythm, albeit some of the rhythmic forms are more flexible than others. However, only 2 of the 4 have rhyme. Rhyme does give the poem a musical quality, but rhythm contributes to the musicality as well, not just in terms of the pattern of stressed and unstressed syllables, but also with techniques such as repetition, enjambment, punctuation, emphasis, and line length. This music is what makes poetry an art form, but there are many ways to produce it, and rhyme is just one of them. And finally, when you finish writing your essay, it's also a good idea to include a bibliography. You put in all that hard work doing your reading, you've quoted things in your essay, so you need to list your sources in the bibliography at the end. And if you're studying at a school or university, they will have a preferred format that they will probably specify. The one that I was always told to use when I was studying was the Harvard system. So if you don't have a particular one, perhaps you might like to look that one up. And some tutors do require you at the end to include the word count so that they know exactly how many words there are in your essay, if that's a particular requirement of the course. I haven't included the full texts of the poems in my essay. If I was submitting that to an examiner, I would probably include an appendix with the texts of the poems. But if you're interested to look at the poems, I'll include links to those in the description below. I hope you found that useful. I hope you found something in there that you can apply to your essay writing process. I wish you every success with writing your essays. I hope you achieve the desired grades, and I hope you enjoyed the process of researching and writing your essay. My next video will be a shorter language-focused video, and we're going to look at a particular aspect of language that applies to all kinds of writing, but it is also relevant to essay writing, and that is register. Thank you very much for joining me in this video. I look forward to seeing you in the next one, and in the meantime, happy writing.